Hey guys, so I wanted to make sort of a passive build, and in Path of Exile 1 there are many passive builds, and among the favorite ones are Herald of Thunder builds. I can't figure out a better word to describe the build, and YouTube may not like, but I'm not really getting many views, so who cares. Autobomber build. In Path of Exile 1, Autobomber builds are usually like a Herald of Thunder that automatically hits enemies without you doing anything, just standing around, and it also kind of has to involve some explosions. So enemies exploding and you are passively doing damage. In Path of Exile 2 that is a lot harder to do. There are some like Thorns builds and I guess Wind Dance also explodes sort of like AoE, but it requires you to get hit. But I wanted something that would not require me to get hit and I could still passively do a build. Well, it doesn't really work. I mean, it does work, but it's really bad. And the idea was to use, there are a couple shenanigans happening. But before I tell you how this build functions, it didn't really work how I wanted it, but I was surprised that it still worked much better than I expected. So if I don't do anything and just try to passively clear, it's very slow. Sometimes it's fast because of shenanigans, but if I just use one skill, it becomes like 10 times faster than doing nothing. So here's the idea, was to use Guiding Palm of the Mind, which does have a guided Tempest Shrine, which is essentially like bolts striking from the ground. Sadly, those bolts are like completely random on the screen, it seems. The area at which it sees the enemies is also not very huge. I was trying to test if presence area affected how far it can detect monsters, but I don't think that it works. But once it detects, it kind of strikes everywhere on the screen multiple times. I already made a video discussing exactly how this works. The damage is non-scalable for players unless you debuff enemies, and the damage of the guided Tempest Shrines seems to automatically get higher when you go into higher level areas. So when you go into like tier 15 maps, it starts doing noticeable damage, even one-shotting normal monsters, but because it's so random, you can never rely on it clearing or just even in general hitting bosses, but it can do pretty decent damage. So my idea was to use that, then to combine Deadeye has a cold shot skill which essentially automatically uses a mark skill, and I am using Voltaic Mark, which is an attack now. It auto applies to enemies. It does have a cooldown when it jumps to enemies. It applies every 5 seconds to nearby enemy. When that enemy dies, the Voltaic Mark explodes and it's pretty big AoE, and that explosion can wipe out the rest of the enemies. My idea was to use this scepter with the Voltaic Mark Deadeye, and hopefully the scepter would strike the target that is marked. That target dies, it kills the other enemies. Then I add other explosions from like Herald of Thunder, Herald of Ice, because it is an attack. And a very extremely sad part is that in 0.2 Heralds requires you to kill enemies with non-Herald attack skills. The Herald itself cannot proc another Herald like a chain explode. So Herald of Ice cannot chain explode infinitely like it used to be before, because that was too fun and that's not allowed. I kind of learned that a bit too late when I was already playing the build. Now I have to rely on Voltaic Mark to proc Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder. We cannot chain explode like we used to. The shrine does too little and too inconsistent damage, and Voltaic Mark has a cooldown when it jumps to next target, which is half a second, which sometimes feels weird because when it wipes out multiple enemies, it jumps to the next enemy, procs another explosion, and the most I saw was like 3 procs, which is weird because I would think that it would only proc once, because if it tries to chain explode the Voltaic Mark, it would still be on cooldown, the half a second cooldown, and it wouldn't jump more than once. But it does sometimes jump twice, maybe even 3 times. I actually do not have much cold damage anymore. The explosion still does quite a bit of cold damage, but it's mostly lighting. But that cold damage sometimes is enough to proc chill, because I'm using this ring which name I cannot pronounce. All I need to do is chill enemies, and chilling is much easier with cold damage than freezing. So against normal enemies it does very often shatter, and when it shatters it procs Herald of Ice, as long as that hit that procced it was non-Herald hit. So again, Voltaic Mark procs Herald of Thunder and Herald of Ice at the same time. Yeah, sometimes it does chain explode, almost not really the whole screen, but couple of steps chain explodes, and it does feel fun and satisfying when that happens, but most of the time you cannot rely on the shrine to hit the right enemy. That's why I'm also using companions. However, companions, even when you invest a lot of passive points into companion damage and tankiness, we're still so bad. Their damage is so bad. I am using frozen mandibles. I don't want to activate because we make too much noise, and I have not found a second companion that I would like, so I'm using Quadrilla. And I did try to get Frozen Mandible with Enraged, and Enraged does give quite a lot of damage, skill damage and speed, and less damage taken. And then extra lighting damage, and I am using Calming Calamity, which means enemies in your presence have no elemental resistance. This should work for minions, as I understand. It's similar to Dorian's prototype, it just doesn't lower into negative. So enemies in your presence have no elemental resistances. But yeah, essentially, I thought that with this combo, the Frozen Mandible would do noticeable damage, but it's still really bad. I am scaling my own damage through the companion damage, so companion increases to companion damage affects me as well. The build is a bit too squishy. I could not get better evasion, but also kind of gave up on the build because it wasn't really auto, it was semi-auto, and even then, as soon as I throw Stormlance, I chose to use Stormlance because it zaps enemies multiple times when you lodge a spear into the ground. And you can also detonate the spear with a detonator skill, which I just failed. That's how you do it. Then this happens, and it's a bit too dangerous to use Thunderous Leap. You could use Explosive Spear instead, but I'm also using Elemental Sundering, which does quite a lot of damage, but it's way too delayed. In the skill preview it's not as delayed, it's almost instant, but in game it's too delayed. I don't really like using it, but it does cover a pretty big area around me, which can trigger multiple explosions and overlap on the same target. So that is nice, but against single target, this is suffering. The Stormlance, I was hoping like I can launch 3 spears and then detonate for bigger damage, and it works, but it's too dangerous because I'm not tank enough, and using Elemental Sundering also removes shock. So in the end, it didn't really work well enough, sadly. But I'm gonna quickly go over what I have. For defenses, I'm trying to just stack evasion, which I don't have much, 6.2k evasion and 22% deflection chance, which isn't great. But I also use things that take damage from my companions instead of me. I just don't think that it takes from each companion like an additional time. So having multiple companions does not mean that you mitigate more damage. I assume it would be OP because with 3 companions you could get like 100% mitigation. So I got Star Conjure because corrupted one goes to 18% damage taken from companion. Then in Frozen Mandible I also use Loyalty, which is another 10%, and there is 5% on the passive skill tree. So this is over 30% damage taken from companion. But that also means that companions need to be very tanky, and Frozen Mandible currently only has, there we go, 8.6k life, but not quite capped on res, and the basic attack damage is like really low, 5k DPS. And I do have quite a lot of companion damage nodes. I'm jumping to get these to save a couple of passive points on travel. I am taking Lucky Lighting and also this one, so that's like 50% Lucky Lighting damage, some Herald stuff, and Calming Calamity. Heralds do not reserve. So if you open my PUB, you're gonna see that it has way over reserved spirit, but that's not the case in game because these do not reserve any spirit. However, if you put something like Deadly Herald, which adds 20 spirit, then it adds reservation. If I remove this, you can see that it changes the spirit reservation. However, for the scepter, for the unique scepter that I have, which gives Spirit of Lighting, this spirit does not change. I can add anything inside Spirit of Lighting. That's why I really started using this scepter more and more, because it just gives extra spirit, it gives extra lighting damage, and also it gives you a free aura, and you can use as many supports with as much spirit requirement as you like. Now, Herald of Ash is actually disabled. I cannot turn this off in here, so it's only Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder that is working. I'm not gonna go over all the passives, it's not worth it, and all the supports, but I will include Path of Building import code. You can check it out if you want. But yeah, I chose Spear because you need an attack weapon, a martial weapon for the heralds, and for, well, Voltaic Mark has its own damage, but it is not melee, it is just an attack. So you cannot use gloves with plus levels to melee skills. I mean, you can for the elemental surge, but it won't increase levels of Voltaic Mark. But here we are. Maybe you're gonna get inspired by some of the mechanics from this. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. I already have a next build and I think it will be good. I won't say what the next build is gonna be because I feel like it may be a bit too strong if things work out well enough, and it may change the prices before I can make the build. So yeah, that's it for now. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.